The notification sound from my phone pierced through the comfortable silence of my hotel room like a knife. I was still in my pajamas, savoring the last moments of what had been the most beautiful family reunion weekend in years. My hair was messy from sleep, and I had that drowsy, content feeling you get after 2 days of laughter, shared meals, and reconnecting with people you love. The sound was my banking app, just a routine notification, I thought. Maybe a confirmation of yesterday's dinner bill I'd happily covered for everyone. I stretched, smiled at the memory of my nephew's gap-toothed grin when I'd bought him that expensive toy robot he'd been eyeing all weekend, and casually swiped to check the notification. The number that appeared on my screen made my stomach drop so hard I thought I might be sick. My checking account balance read -$412. But that was impossible. Just Friday morning, before driving down for the reunion, I had over $8,000 in that account. $8,000 I'd been carefully saving for the down payment on my first house. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Cassandra, and I'm 31 years old. I work as a medical technician at St. Mary's Hospital, and I've been saving every extra penny for 3 years to buy my own place. Not a fancy house, just something small with a garden where I could finally feel like I belonged somewhere. This is the story of how my own family tried to steal that dream from me, and how I made sure they paid for every single dollar they took. I sat on the edge of the hotel bed, staring at my phone screen, refreshing the app over and over like it might change the numbers through sheer force of will. But the red negative sign stayed there, mocking me. My hands were shaking as I scrolled through the transaction history. 7 separate withdrawals, all made yesterday during the reunion, all for large amounts. 2,000 here, 1,500 there, another 1,000, then 2 more for 800 each. The timestamp showed they'd happened throughout the day, starting at 11 in the morning and continuing until nearly midnight. Each withdrawal was marked as an ATM transaction, which meant someone had physically used my debit card and known my PIN number. Someone who had access to my purse during the reunion, someone I trusted enough to leave my belongings unattended while I played with the kids in the backyard or helped my aunt serve dinner. Someone in my own family had systematically drained my entire savings account while I was celebrating with them. The betrayal hit me like a physical blow. I actually doubled over, clutching my stomach as the reality sank in. While I was buying rounds of drinks for everyone at the karaoke bar, someone was using my card at ATMs across town. While I was helping my cousin set up the surprise slideshow for my grandmother's 80th birthday, someone was stealing my future. While I was laughing until my sides hurt at my uncle's terrible dad jokes, someone was taking the money I'd skipped lunches to save, the money I'd earned working double shifts on holidays. I called the bank immediately, my voice cracking as I explained the situation to the customer service representative. She was kind but firm in explaining the reality. Since the transactions were made with my actual debit card and the correct PIN, they weren't classified as fraud. The bank would investigate, but these cases rarely resulted in recovered funds unless there was clear evidence of theft that could be prosecuted. She suggested I file a police report and contact the locations where the withdrawals were made to see if security footage was available. After hanging up, I sat in the terrible silence of that hotel room, staring at the floral wallpaper and trying to process what had happened. My savings were gone. 3 years of sacrifice, of choosing the generic brand at the grocery store, of driving my beat-up Honda instead of getting a car loan, of living in a cramped studio apartment because the rent was $200 cheaper than anything bigger. All of it had been stolen by someone who was supposed to love me. I thought back through the weekend, trying to remember every moment, every interaction, every time I'd left my purse unattended. The family reunion had been held at my Uncle Robert's house in Millfield, a sprawling ranch-style home with a huge backyard perfect for the kids to run around in. There had been about 25 people there over the 2 days: aunts, uncles, cousins, their spouses, children ranging from toddlers to teenagers. It was the first time in 5 years that everyone had managed to coordinate schedules and come together. My purse had been in the guest bedroom for most of Saturday, along with everyone else's coats and bags. That room had seen a constant stream of people throughout the day. People getting their phones to take pictures, grabbing their car keys to move vehicles around, retrieving gifts they'd brought for my grandmother. Anyone could have gone through my wallet without being noticed. Anyone could have memorized my PIN if they'd watched me use it at some point. But the more I thought about it, the more one interaction kept replaying in my mind. It had happened on Saturday afternoon when I was in the kitchen helping my Aunt Martha prepare dinner. My brother-in-law Derek had been standing nearby, leaning against the counter with his arms crossed, making jokes about how expensive everything was getting these days. Derek was married to my sister Patricia, and they'd been having financial problems for months. Patricia had confided in me that they were behind on their mortgage, that Derek's construction business was struggling, and that they were considering filing for bankruptcy. I remembered Derek asking me about my job, about whether the hospital paid well, about my plans for the future. When I'd mentioned that I was hoping to buy a house soon, his eyes had gotten this strange look in them. Not happy for me, not congratulatory, but almost calculating. He'd asked specific questions about my down payment, about how much I'd managed to save, about which bank I used. At the time, I thought he was just making conversation, maybe even looking for advice about his own financial situation. Now, thinking back, I realized he'd been gathering information. He'd positioned himself perfectly to overhear when I gave my aunt my debit card to pick up ice cream for dessert, asking me to write down my PIN since she wasn't good with remembering numbers. I'd written it on a napkin without thinking twice about it. Family, you trust family. Derek had been right there, close enough to see those 4 digits that would later unlock my entire savings account. The more I replayed the weekend, the more convinced I became that Derek was responsible. He'd disappeared for long stretches throughout Saturday, claiming he was making work phone calls or checking on his truck. He'd been notably absent during the group photos in the afternoon, and Patricia made excuses about him needing to handle some urgent business matters. At the time, I'd thought nothing of it. Now, I realized those absences lined up perfectly with the withdrawal timestamps on my account. I spent the rest of Sunday morning in that hotel room making phone calls and trying to piece together a plan. I called the police in Millfield and filed a report, though the officer I spoke with was honest about the slim chances of recovering the money. I called each of the ATM locations where the withdrawals had been made, asking about security camera footage, but was told I'd need to work with the police to access any recordings. I called my sister Patricia, not to accuse Derek directly, but to feel out the situation.
Patricia sounded strange on the phone, distracted and nervous. When I mentioned that I'd had some unexpected financial issues and might not be able to help with my grandmother's birthday gift like I'd planned, she got defensive. She started talking rapidly about how everyone was struggling these days, how it wasn't fair that some people seemed to have everything while others were barely getting by. Her tone was bitter, resentful even, and completely unlike the warm, supportive sister I'd been laughing with just yesterday. When I asked if she'd seen anything unusual at the reunion, if anyone had mentioned having financial emergencies or needing quick cash, she became even more agitated. She accused me of being paranoid and suggested that maybe I'd simply made a mistake with my account balance. The conversation ended badly, with Patricia hanging up on me after saying that maybe I should focus on my own problems instead of trying to create drama in the family. That phone call confirmed my suspicions more than any security footage could have. Patricia knew something, and her defensive reaction told me everything I needed to know about who was responsible for my missing money. But knowing and proving are 2 different things, and I needed evidence before I could take any real action. I checked out of the hotel and drove straight home to my cramped studio apartment. The drive gave me time to think, to plan, and to let my initial shock transform into something harder and more focused. By the time I pulled into my parking spot, I wasn't just devastated anymore. I was angry, the kind of cold, calculating anger that comes when someone you love betrays you in the most fundamental way possible. My apartment felt different when I walked in, smaller somehow, more temporary. I'd been so excited to leave this place behind, to finally have space for a real dining table and maybe even a home office where I could pursue my dream of starting a medical consulting business on the side. Now, looking at my fold-out couch and my tiny kitchen, I realized I might be stuck here for years longer while I rebuilt my savings from scratch. I sat down at my laptop and started researching. I learned about ATM security systems, about how banks track transactions, about the legal requirements for theft prosecution. I studied the locations where my money had been withdrawn, mapping them out and looking for patterns. 3 of the withdrawals had been made at ATMs within a 5-mile radius of Derek's construction company office. 2 others were near his usual job sites. The timeline suggested someone who knew the area well, someone with legitimate reasons to be driving around that part of town throughout the day. But research wasn't enough. I needed concrete evidence, and I needed a way to confront Derek without him simply denying everything and disappearing with my money. I had to be smart about this, strategic. One wrong move, and I'd not only lose my savings forever, but I'd also tear apart my family in the process. And despite everything, despite the betrayal and the theft, these people were still my family. I still loved my sister, still wanted to preserve the relationships that mattered. That's when I remembered my grandmother's stories about my grandfather's business dealings. He'd been a successful contractor himself back in the day, and she'd often talked about how he handled disputes and difficult clients. He believed in giving people a chance to do the right thing, but he also believed in being prepared for when they chose not to. He documented everything, kept careful records, and always had a backup plan. Following his example, I spent the next week building my case methodically. I requested detailed bank records showing the exact times and locations of each withdrawal. I called my insurance company to see if my savings account was covered under any kind of theft protection policy. I researched private investigators in case I needed professional help gathering evidence. I even drove to each ATM location, noting their positions relative to Derek's construction company office and taking photos of the security camera placements. Most importantly, I started documenting every conversation I had with family members about the situation. When my cousin called to thank me for covering dinner at the reunion, I casually asked if he'd noticed anyone acting strangely that weekend. When my Aunt Martha texted to share photos from the reunion, I mentioned my financial problems and watched carefully for her reaction. Every response, every deflection, every nervous laugh was noted and saved. By the end of that week, I had a clear picture of what had happened and who was responsible. But I also had something else, a plan for how to handle it. I wasn't going to let Derek destroy my family by forcing me to accuse him publicly. I wasn't going to let my sister's marriage implode because her husband was a thief. And I sure as hell wasn't going to let them get away with stealing my future. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. Patricia called me on Friday evening, her voice artificially bright and cheerful. She wanted to know if I'd like to come over for dinner on Saturday, just the 3 of us, to decompress from the reunion and catch up properly. Derek had been asking about me, she said, wondering how I was doing after mentioning my financial stress during our phone call. I almost laughed at the transparent setup. Derek wanted to gauge how much I knew, to see if I suspected him, maybe even to gloat about what he'd gotten away with. Perfect. I accepted the invitation immediately and spent the rest of Friday evening preparing for what would either be the most important conversation of my life or the complete destruction of my relationship with my sister. Saturday afternoon, I drove to Patricia and Derek's house in the suburbs, a modest 2-story colonial that they'd bought during better times. The yard was overgrown, and I noticed several overdue payment notices in their mailbox. Their financial situation was clearly even worse than Patricia had let on, which probably explained Derek's desperation, but certainly didn't excuse his theft. Patricia greeted me at the door with enthusiasm that felt forced. She'd obviously been coached by Derek on how to act, how to seem normal and loving despite what they'd done. She led me into their living room where Derek was sprawled in his recliner, beer in hand, looking like he didn't have a care in the world. The casual arrogance of his posture made my blood boil. This man had stolen my entire life savings, and he was sitting there drinking beer and watching television like nothing had happened. When he looked up at me, I saw something in his eyes that confirmed everything I suspected. Not guilt, not remorse, but a kind of smug satisfaction. He knew exactly what he'd done, and he thought he'd gotten away with it. We made small talk through dinner, though the conversation felt stilted and unnatural. Patricia kept shooting nervous glances at Derek, while he seemed to be enjoying some private joke. When we had finished eating, Derek leaned back in his chair and fixed me with what he probably thought was a concerned look. "So, Patricia tells me you're having some money troubles," he said. his tone dripping with fake sympathy. That's rough, especially when you've been working so hard to save up for a house. Sometimes life just throws you curveballs, you know? I nodded, playing along with his performance. It's been really stressful, I admitted. I had over $8,000 in my account last Friday, and by Sunday morning, it was all gone. The bank says someone used my debit card and PIN to make withdrawals all over town during the reunion.
Derek's expression didn't change, but I caught the slight tightening around his eyes. He'd been expecting this conversation, preparing for it. You think someone at the reunion took your card? That's crazy. I mean, it was all family there. Who would do something like that? His question hung in the air like a challenge. This was the moment of truth, the point where I either backed down or pushed forward. I looked at Patricia, who was staring down at her plate, unable to meet my eyes. Then I looked back at Derek, who was still wearing that mask of fake concern. I don't know, I said slowly, but I've been thinking about it all week, and I keep coming back to the same question. Who else knew about my savings? Who else heard me mention my PIN when I gave Aunt Martha my card? Who else disappeared from the reunion for hours at a time? The silence that followed was deafening. Patricia had gone completely still, fork halfway to her mouth. Derek's jaw had tightened almost imperceptibly, but his expression remained neutral. We stared at each other across the dinner table, and I could practically see him calculating his next move. Finally, he shrugged and took a swig of his beer. Sounds like you're trying to blame family for your problems, Cassandra. Maybe you should look at yourself first. Maybe you made some mistakes, forgot some transactions, got confused about your balance. It happens to the best of us. The dismissive tone in his voice was the last straw. All week, I'd been trying to give him the benefit of the doubt, hoping against hope that I was wrong about him. But hearing him sit there and gaslight me, trying to make me doubt my own memory and sanity, crystallized everything. This wasn't just theft. It was psychological warfare, and he was enjoying every minute of it. I reached into my purse and pulled out a folder I'd prepared. Inside were printed bank records, a timeline of the withdrawals, photos of the ATM locations, and a map showing their proximity to Derek's workplace. I spread them out on the table like I was laying down cards in a poker game. These are the facts, I said calmly. 7 withdrawals, all made with my actual debit card and PIN. All made during the reunion while I was accounted for by multiple witnesses. All made at locations within a few miles of your office and job sites. All made by someone who knew exactly how much money I had and where I kept my account information. Derek's face had gone pale, but he was still trying to maintain his innocent act. That doesn't prove anything, he said, but his voice had lost its confident edge. You're grasping at straws, trying to make innocent coincidences look suspicious. Patricia finally looked up from her plate. Her face was streaked with tears, and when she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Derek, she said, tell me you didn't do this. Please tell me you didn't steal from my sister. The mask finally slipped. Derek's expression shifted from fake concern to cold irritation, and when he spoke, all pretense of innocence was gone. We needed it more than she did, he snorted, gesturing dismissively in my direction. Miss Perfect over here with her steady job and her savings account, acting like she's better than everyone else. We're about to lose the house, Patricia. Our kids were going to be out on the street. So excuse me if I don't feel guilty about taking money from someone who had more than enough to spare. The admission hung in the air like poison. Patricia let out a sob and buried her face in her hands. I felt a strange sense of relief mixed with devastation. I'd been right about Derek, but being right didn't make the betrayal hurt any less. You stole my future, I said quietly. That money wasn't spare change. It was 3 years of my life. 3 years of sacrifice and planning and hope, and you took it like it belonged to you. Derek stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. Well, it's gone now, he said with a shrug. What are you going to do about it? Call the cops? Go ahead. It'll be your word against mine, and good luck proving anything in court. Besides, you really want to put Patricia's husband in jail? You want to destroy your sister's family over money? The casual cruelty of his words, the way he was using my love for Patricia as a weapon against me, made something snap inside my chest. This wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about justice, about accountability, about refusing to let him turn me into a victim twice over. I pulled out my phone and showed him the screen. On it was a recording app, and the red record button was clearly visible. "Every word you just said was recorded," I told him, "including your confession, including your admission that you stole my money and your threat to hide behind Patricia to avoid consequences." Derek's face went white. He reached for my phone, but I pulled it back out of his reach. The recording was already uploaded to cloud storage and sent to my email. Even if he broke my phone, the evidence would still exist. "You set me up," he said, his voice shaking with rage. "You came here planning this." "I came here hoping you'd do the right thing," I replied. "I came here hoping you'd admit what you did and offer to pay me back. Instead, you tried to gaslight me and threaten my family. So yes, I was prepared for that possibility." Patricia was still crying, but now she was looking at Derek with horror rather than confusion. "How could you do this?" she whispered. "How could you steal from Cassandra and then lie to me about it? How could you make me complicit in this?" Derek turned on her with the same casual cruelty he'd shown me. "Don't act like you didn't know," he snarled. "You saw the cash I brought home. You saw me paying bills that we couldn't afford last week. You didn't ask questions because you didn't want to know the answers." But Patricia was shaking her head, her face crumpling. "I thought you'd gotten a bonus from the Morrison job. I thought you'd been hiding money from me, not stealing it from my sister. Oh God, Derek, what have you done to our family?" The fight that followed was ugly and devastating. Derek blamed everyone but himself, while Patricia swung between rage at her husband and guilt over her own willful ignorance. I sat there watching my sister's marriage implode in real time, feeling simultaneously vindicated and heartbroken. Eventually, Derek stormed out, slamming the door so hard the windows rattled. Patricia and I were left alone in the wreckage of what had been a family dinner. She looked at me with red-rimmed eyes and asked the question I'd been dreading. "What happens now?" she whispered. "What are you going to do with that recording?" I'd been thinking about that all week, and I knew exactly what I wanted. This wasn't about revenge or punishment. This was about making things right and protecting myself from future manipulation. "I want my money back," I said simply. "All of it, with interest to cover the fees and penalties his theft caused. I want it in writing, signed and notarized. And I want it paid back on a schedule that doesn't destroy your family, but also doesn't take forever." Patricia nodded through her tears. "And if he refuses?" "Then I'll file a police report and turn over the recording. I'll let the courts decide what happens to him. But I'd rather handle this as a family if possible." Over the next week, Patricia and I worked together to create a repayment plan. Derek was initially resistant, still believing he could manipulate his way out of consequences. But when Patricia threatened to leave him unless he made things right with me, he finally agreed to terms. The plan required him to pay me back $1,500 a month for 6 months, plus an additional $500 to cover fees and lost interest. It wasn't fast enough to restore my original house buying timeline, but it was realistic given their financial situation. More importantly, it was documented legally, which meant Derek couldn't simply disappear or claim the debt didn't exist. The hardest part was watching how the theft affected Patricia. She blamed herself for not seeing what Derek was becoming, for not asking harder questions about their sudden improvement in cash flow. Their marriage survived, but it was fundamentally changed. Trust, once broken, doesn't just repair itself overnight. As for Derek, the consequences extended beyond just paying me back. Word of what he'd done spread through the family despite our attempts at discretion. His construction business suffered as relatives stopped recommending him to friends and neighbors. His reputation in the community took a hit when some of the story leaked out. Most importantly, he had to live with the knowledge that everyone in his life now knew exactly what kind of person he was when pushed to the wall. The money came back slowly but steadily. Each month, Derek would transfer $1,500 into my account, usually late and often accompanied by bitter complaints about how the payments were destroying his budget. I didn't care about his attitude. I cared about results, and the results were exactly what I demanded. By month 4, something interesting started happening. Derek's payments began arriving early, and Patricia mentioned that he'd been working harder than she'd seen in years. Apparently, having a concrete deadline and legal consequences hanging over his head had motivated him in ways that simple financial pressure never had. He was taking on additional projects, working weekends, and actually managing his business more efficiently. The transformation wasn't complete, and I never trusted him the way I had before the reunion. But I started to see glimpses of the man my sister had fallen in love with years earlier. Someone who could rise to challenges when he had to, who could work hard when the alternative was losing everything that mattered. The final payment arrived on a Tuesday morning in February, exactly 6 months after our confrontation dinner. Along with the $1,500 he owed, Derek had included an additional $200 and a handwritten note. The note was brief, awkward, but genuine in its simplicity. It said, "I'm sorry for what I did. I know this doesn't make up for it, but I wanted you to know that I've learned from it. Thank you for handling this the way you did." I stared at that note for a long time, trying to process the complex emotions it stirred up. I wasn't ready to forgive Derek completely, and I might never be.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
But I was grateful that he'd finally acknowledged the severity of what he'd done and taken responsibility for making it right. With my savings restored and then some, I was finally able to start house shopping again. The delay had actually worked in my favor, as interest rates had dropped and several properties in my target area had reduced their asking prices. By spring, I was signing papers on a small 2-bedroom craftsman house with the garden I dreamed of and enough space to finally set up that home office. The day I got my keys, I called my grandmother to share the good news. During our conversation, she mentioned how proud she was of how I'd handled the situation with Garrick. Apparently, Patricia had confided in her about what had happened and how I'd chosen to resolve it privately rather than involving the police. "You reminded me of your grandfather," she told me. "He always said that the measure of a person isn't whether they make mistakes, but how they handle those mistakes and whether they learn from them. You gave Derek a chance to learn, and more importantly, you showed him what integrity looks like." Looking back on everything that happened, I realized that the theft had taught me as much about myself as it had about Derek. I'd learned that I was stronger than I thought, more strategic than I'd realized, and more forgiving than I'd expected. I'd also learned that family isn't just about blood relationships, but about the choices we make and the values we uphold. The house purchase went through without any complications, and I spent my first weekend as a homeowner planting tomatoes and herbs in my new garden. As I worked in the soil, getting my hands dirty and planning for the harvest to come, I thought about growth and second chances. Some plants need to be pruned severely before they can flourish. Some relationships need to be tested before they can be trusted. And sometimes, the worst thing that happens to you can teach you the most important lessons about who you are and what you're capable of. Derek and Patricia's marriage continued to heal, slowly and with professional help. They attended counseling together and separately, working through the financial stress and trust issues that had contributed to his decision to steal from me. Their kids never learned the full details of what had happened, but they benefited from having parents who were finally addressing their problems honestly instead of pretending everything was fine. The family reunions continued, though they felt different now. There was an underlying awareness that we weren't as perfect as we'd pretended to be, that even people who love each other can hurt each other in devastating ways. But there was also a new kind of honesty, a willingness to address problems before they became crises. Derek never tried to justify what he'd done again, and he never asked for my forgiveness outright. Instead, he showed his remorse through consistent actions over time. He paid every installment exactly when he'd promised. He found steady work and started managing money more responsibly. He treated Patricia with more respect and started contributing equally to household decisions. Most importantly, he never asked me to pretend the theft hadn't happened or to trust him the way I had before. The recording I'd made that night remained in my digital files, a insurance policy I hoped never to need again. But knowing it was there, knowing I had concrete evidence of what had transpired, gave me a sense of security that went beyond the monetary compensation.
Derek might have stolen my money, but he couldn't steal my truth or rewrite history to make himself look better. As I settled into my new home and my new life, I realized that the theft had changed me in ways that went far beyond financial planning. I was more careful about trust now, but not cynical. I was more protective of my boundaries, but not isolated. I was more aware of people's capacity for self-justification, but not judgmental. Most importantly, I was more confident in my ability to handle whatever challenges life might throw at me. The house fund grew again, slowly but steadily, as I continued the habits that had served me well the first time around. But now I also had an emergency fund, better security measures for my accounts, and a deeper understanding of how quickly circumstances could change. I'd learned that financial security wasn't just about having money, but about having the knowledge and skills to protect and rebuild wealth when necessary. The garden flourished that first summer, producing more tomatoes and herbs than I could use. I started sharing the surplus with neighbors, building new relationships in my community, and creating the sense of belonging I'd been seeking when I first started saving for a house. The home I'd worked so hard to buy became not just a shelter, but a foundation for the life I wanted to build. And on quiet evenings, when I was watering my plants or reading on my back porch, I would sometimes think about that terrible morning in the hotel room when I first discovered the theft. The devastation I'd felt, the betrayal that had cut so deep, the fear that I might never recover what I'd lost. All of that had been real and valid, but it hadn't been permanent. I had recovered, both financially and emotionally. I had chosen healing over hatred, strategy over revenge, and building over burning bridges. The story wasn't over, of course. Derek would continue making payments for 2 more months, and then we'd need to figure out what our relationship would look like going forward. Patricia and I were still rebuilding our sisterly bond, learning how to trust each other again after the secrets and lies that had poisoned our family dynamics. The extended family was still processing what had happened and working to prevent similar situations in the future. But as I sat in my own house, in my own garden, surrounded by the security I'd built through my own efforts and protected through my own strength, I felt something I hadn't expected to feel again so soon. I felt grateful. Not grateful for what Derek had done, but grateful for what I'd learned about myself in the process of surviving it. Grateful for the opportunity to prove to myself that I was more resilient than I'd known. Grateful for the chance to show my family what accountability and integrity looked like in practice. The money had been important, but it had never been the most important thing. The most important thing was knowing that I could face a crisis and emerge from it stronger, wiser, and more capable than before. That knowledge was worth more than any savings account, and unlike money, it was something no one could ever steal from me. 3 months after moving into my new house, I thought the drama with Derek was behind us. The monthly payments were arriving on schedule, family dinners had resumed their normal rhythm, and Patricia seemed genuinely happy for the first time in years. I was wrong about it being over. If anything, I was about to learn that some people never really change, they just get better at hiding who they truly are. The first sign of trouble came on a Thursday evening when I was tending to my herb garden. The late summer sun was casting long shadows across my backyard, and I was deadheading the basil plants when my phone buzzed with a text from my cousin Marcus. Marcus lived 3 states away and rarely contacted family members directly, so seeing his name on my screen immediately put me on alert. The message was brief but alarming. "Hey Cassandra, weird question, but did you give Derek permission to use your name for some kind of business thing? He called me asking about investing in a construction project and mentioned you were his business partner now. Seemed off to me, so wanted to check." My blood went cold as I read those words. Derek had been making his payments to me religiously, never missing a deadline, never complaining about the amount. I'd started to believe that maybe he really had learned from his mistakes, that the theft had been an aberration brought on by desperation rather than a reflection of his true character. But this message suggested something far more sinister was happening. I called Marcus immediately, not wanting to risk any misunderstanding for text messages. He answered on the second ring, and I could hear the relief in his voice when I confirmed that I was definitely not Derek's business partner, in any capacity.
Thank God, Marcus said. The whole conversation felt wrong to me. He was trying to get me to invest $20,000 in some commercial renovation project, claiming you'd vouched for him and that you were putting in money too. When I asked to speak with you directly, he said you were out of town on a medical conference and couldn't be reached. The lies were so elaborate, so specifically crafted, that I knew this wasn't a spur-of-the-moment scheme. Derek had been planning this for weeks, maybe months,
He'd probably been making similar calls to other family members, using my professional reputation and perceived financial stability to legitimize whatever con he was running. I spent the next hour on the phone, calling every relative I could think of who might have been contacted by Derek. The picture that emerged was devastating and infuriating. Over the past 6 weeks, Derek had reached out to at least 8 family members with various investment opportunities. To some, he'd claimed I was his business partner. To others, he'd said I was providing financial backing for his projects. In every case, he'd used my name and reputation to lend credibility to schemes that ranged from questionable to outright fraudulent. My Uncle James had almost written a check for $15,000 for a supposed warehouse renovation project. My cousin Sarah had been considering a $10,000 investment in Derek's new medical equipment installation business, a field he knew nothing about but had claimed expertise in because of his connection to me. Most disturbing of all, my elderly Aunt Dorothy had actually given him $5,000 for what he described as a sure thing real estate flip that I was supposedly supervising. Each conversation left me more furious and more heartbroken. Derek wasn't just stealing money this time, he was destroying my relationships with people I loved. He was weaponizing their trust in me to facilitate his cons. Every family member who discovered they've been lied to would associate that betrayal with my name, even though I was as much a victim as they were. The scope of Derek's deception became clear when I started asking detailed questions about the timeline. He'd begun making these calls shortly after our confrontation dinner, even while he was making his restitution payments to me. The theft of my savings hadn't been a desperate mistake that he'd learned from. It had been a proof of concept, a test run for bigger and more sophisticated schemes. I realized that Derek had never felt genuine remorse for stealing from me. He'd only felt regret for getting caught. The monthly payments he'd been making weren't acknowledgement of wrongdoing. They were the cost of doing business, a necessary expense to buy time and credibility for his next round of cons. My forgiveness and discretion hadn't inspired him to become a better person. They'd simply given him cover to become a more effective criminal. The betrayal felt even worse than the original theft because this time it wasn't just about money. Derek was systematically destroying my reputation and my relationships with people who mattered to me. He was turning my professional success and financial responsibility into weapons against my own family. Every lie he told in my name was a theft of my integrity, and unlike money, integrity couldn't be paid back in monthly installments. I called Patricia immediately, hoping against hope that she wasn't aware of what her husband was doing. The conversation was one of the most difficult I'd ever had. Patricia answered on the first ring, sounding cheerful and relaxed, completely unaware that her world was about to implode again. When I explained what I'd discovered, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. Finally, Patricia spoke, and her voice was so quiet I had to strain to hear her. "Oh God, Cassandra, I'm wondering where some of that extra money was coming from. He said he'd gotten a big bonus from the Henderson project, but when I asked to see the paperwork, he said it was complicated and that I wouldn't understand the details." The confirmation that Patricia had been willfully ignorant again made my heart sink. She'd learned nothing from the first crisis. When Derek started bringing home money they couldn't account for, she'd chosen not to ask hard questions because the alternative was facing uncomfortable truths about her husband's character. "How much money are we talking about, Patricia?" I asked, dreading the answer. "I don't know exactly, maybe $15,000 over the past month and a half. He's been paying down credit cards, catching up on the mortgage, even talking about taking a vacation this winter." $15,000 that had come directly from our family members, people who trusted Derek because they trusted me. People who were now out their life savings because Patricia had chosen willful ignorance over protecting her own relatives. The conversation deteriorated quickly from there. Patricia became defensive, then angry, accusing me of trying to destroy her marriage and her family's new financial stability. She claimed that Derek's business dealings were none of my concern as long as he kept making his payments to me. When I pointed out that he was using my name to defraud our relatives, she accused me of being paranoid and jealous of their improved circumstances. The call ended with Patricia hanging up on me, but not before she'd made it clear that she had no intention of confronting Derek or helping to resolve the situation. For the second time in less than a year, I was faced with the reality that my sister was willing to sacrifice family relationships to protect her husband's criminal behavior. That night, I sat in my kitchen with a legal pad and started documenting everything I'd learned: names, dates, amounts, specific claims Derek had made to each family member. The pattern that emerged was sophisticated and disturbing. Derek hadn't been making random desperate grabs for money. He'd been running a systematic, long-term con, carefully researching each Mark's financial situation and crafting personalized pitches designed to maximize their investment. He'd told my Uncle James that the warehouse project was in James's area of expertise, commercial electrical work. He'd pitched the medical equipment business to Sarah because she worked in healthcare administration. He'd targeted Aunt Dorothy with the real estate flip because she'd recently inherited property and was looking for investment opportunities. In each case, Derek had used information gathered at family gatherings to create seemingly legitimate business opportunities that played to each person's specific interests and financial capacity. Most disturbingly, Derek had been using details about my career and finances that he could only have obtained through Patricia. He'd known about my recent promotion at the hospital, my plans to start a consulting business, even my interest in real estate investment. Someone had been feeding him inside information about my life, and that someone could only be my sister. The realization that Patricia was actively collaborating with Derek's schemes rather than simply turning a blind eye to them fundamentally changed how I viewed the situation. This wasn't a case of a desperate man making bad choices while his wife remained ignorant. This was a criminal partnership, with Patricia serving as Derek's intelligence gatherer and character witness. I spent the weekend researching my legal options and the potential consequences for Derek's actions. What he was doing went far beyond simple theft. By using my name and reputation to solicit investments for non-existent businesses, he was committing wire fraud, securities fraud, and potentially racketeering if the scheme was large enough. The penalties for these crimes were severe, including significant prison time and restitution requirements that could follow him for decades. But pursuing criminal charges would mean destroying Patricia's family and potentially implicating her as an accessory to Derek's crimes. Their children would lose their father to prison and their mother to criminal proceedings. The family would be torn apart with relationships that could never be repaired.
On the other hand, allowing Derek to continue his schemes would mean more family members would lose their savings, more relationships would be damaged, and Derek would continue to use my name and reputation to facilitate his cons. At some point, someone would discover that I wasn't actually involved in these business deals, and the resulting scandal could damage my career and my standing in the community. I realized that I was facing the same choice I'd confronted after Derek stole my savings, but with much higher stakes this time. I could handle this privately, giving Derek another chance to make things right, or I could involve law enforcement and let the legal system handle the consequences. The difference was that this time, Derek had already proven that my mercy was something he saw as weakness to be exploited rather than grace to be appreciated. Monday morning, I called Mr. Landry, the attorney who'd helped me with my grandfather's estate issues. I'd kept his contact information, thinking I might need legal advice for my house purchase, but never imagining I'd need his help with criminal matters. He listened to my explanation with professional calm, asking clarifying questions and taking notes as I described Derek's latest schemes. When I finished my account, Mr. Landry was quiet for a moment before speaking. Miss Cassandra, what your brother-in-law is doing constitutes serious federal crimes. The fact that he's using your identity and reputation to facilitate these frauds makes you a victim of identity theft in addition to the financial crimes against your family members. You have grounds for both criminal and civil action. But what about my sister and her children? I asked. If Derek goes to prison, they'll lose everything. That's a consequence Derek should have considered before he chose to commit these crimes, Mr. Landry replied firmly. Your sister's financial situation doesn't give her husband the right to defraud your relatives, and frankly, if she's providing him with information to facilitate these schemes, she may be legally culpable as well. The conversation with Mr. Landry clarified the legal landscape, but it didn't make my decision any easier. I had the power to stop Derek's criminal enterprise, but using that power would destroy what remained of my relationship with Patricia and potentially send her to prison alongside her husband.
I decided to give Derek one final opportunity to make things right, but this time I would be far more strategic about how I approached the situation. I wouldn't rely on his conscience or his family loyalty because he'd already proven he had neither. Instead, I would make it clear that the consequences of continuing his criminal behavior would be swift, certain, and severe. I spent Tuesday evening crafting a detailed letter outlining everything I knew about Derek's investment schemes. I listed each family member he'd contacted, the specific lies he'd told, and the amounts of money he'd obtained through fraud. I documented the federal crimes he was committing and the potential penalties he faced. Most importantly, I gave him 72 hours to return every penny he'd stolen from our relatives and to contact each of them personally to confess what he'd done. The letter concluded with a simple ultimatum. If Derek failed to meet my demands within the specified timeframe, I would turn over all evidence to federal authorities and cooperate fully with their investigation. I hand-delivered the letter to Derek's construction office on Wednesday morning. The receptionist, a middle-aged woman who'd always been friendly when I'd visited with Patricia, looked uncomfortable as she took the sealed envelope. I suspect she'd begun to realize that something wasn't right about Derek's recent business activities, but like many people, she'd chosen not to ask questions that might result in uncomfortable answers. Derek called me within 2 hours of receiving the letter. His voice was tight with barely controlled rage, but I could also hear an undertone of fear. He knew that this time was different, that I wasn't going to handle things quietly to protect family relationships. "You can't prove anything," he said, though his tone suggested he knew that wasn't true. "Those are legitimate business deals. People invested because they believed in the projects, not because of anything I said about you." "Derek," I replied calmly, "I have detailed conversations with 8 family members who can testify about exactly what you told them. I have bank records showing deposits that correlate with their investments. I have documentation of your lies about my involvement in businesses I've never heard of. Most importantly, I have a recording of you confessing to stealing my money, which establishes a pattern of criminal behavior." The silence that followed told me everything I needed to know. Derek understood that he was trapped, that the evidence against him was overwhelming, and that his only choice was to comply with my demands or face federal prosecution. "72 hours isn't enough time," he said finally. "I've already spent some of that money on bills and debt payments. I'll need at least 2 weeks to liquidate assets and gather the cash." "You have 72 hours," I repeated. "If you needed time to gather money, you should have thought about that before you decided to steal it. Figure it out, Derek. Sell your truck, borrow against the house, take cash advances on credit cards. I don't care how you do it, but get the money. And if I can't, then you'll be explaining your business model to federal investigators." Derek tried several more tactics during that phone call. He threatened to claim that I was extorting him. He suggested that pursuing this matter would hurt Patricia and the children more than it would hurt him. He even attempted to negotiate a payment plan similar to the one we'd arranged for my stolen savings. None of these approaches worked because I'd learned from our previous encounter that Derek only responded to consequences, not appeals to conscience or family loyalty. The call ended with Derek agreeing to my terms, though his tone made it clear that he viewed this as a temporary setback rather than a reason to change his behavior permanently. I suspected that as soon as he'd resolved this immediate crisis, he would begin planning his next scheme, probably in a different state or with people outside our family circle. Over the next 72 hours, I monitored Derek's compliance with my compliance with the family members he'd defrauded. One by one, they called to report that Derek had contacted them with various explanations for why their investments needed to be returned immediately. His stories were creative but ultimately implausible, involving everything from sudden changes in zoning regulations to unexpected environmental issues that made the projects impossible to complete. Most of our relatives seemed relieved to get their money back, even if they were confused about the sudden change in circumstances. A few asked probing questions about what had really happened, but I deferred those conversations until I could be sure that Derek had fulfilled all of his obligations. I didn't want to risk him using partial compliance as leverage to avoid complete restitution. By Friday afternoon, Derek had returned money to 7 of the 8 family members he'd defrauded. The only remaining issue was Aunt Dorothy's $5,000, which Derek claimed he was having trouble accessing because it had been invested in a property deal that couldn't be unwound quickly. I suspected this was another lie, that Derek was hoping to buy time or negotiating room by holding on to one victim's money. But I'd been clear about my expectations, and partial compliance wasn't acceptable. I called Derek's office and left a message with his receptionist that he had until 6 o'clock that evening to complete the restitution, or I would be filing criminal complaints first thing Monday morning. The message had its intended effect. At 5:30 Friday evening, Aunt Dorothy called to confirm that Derek had returned her $5,000 in cash, along with a rambling apology about the investment opportunity falling through due to circumstances beyond his control. She seemed satisfied with the explanation, though she mentioned that she would be more careful about future investment opportunities. With the immediate crisis resolved, I faced the question of what to do next. Derek had complied with my demands, but only under threat of criminal prosecution. He hadn't shown genuine remorse or made any commitments about changing his behavior going forward. I had no reason to believe that he wouldn't simply move his operations to a different location or target pool once he thought the heat had died down. I also had to consider my relationship with Patricia, which had been severely damaged by her collaboration with Derek's schemes. She'd chosen to protect his criminal enterprise over the welfare of our family members, and she'd actively provided him with information that he'd used to defraud our relatives. While she hadn't been charged with any crimes, her moral culpability was clear. That weekend, I made a decision that I knew would have long-term consequences for my family relationships. I drafted detailed letters to each family member who'd been targeted by Derek's schemes, explaining exactly what had happened and how their trust had been violated. I didn't include speculation about Patricia's role, but I provided enough information for them to draw their own conclusions about how Derek had obtained such detailed knowledge about their financial situations and personal interests. The letters weren't motivated by revenge or a desire to punish Derek and Patricia further. They were motivated by a responsibility to protect our family from future schemes. Derek had proven that he was willing to exploit family relationships for criminal purposes, and the only way to prevent future victimization was to ensure that everyone understood his true character. I also sent copies of all documentation to several trusted family members, including my grandmother and Uncle James, with instructions to share the information if Derek ever approached them or anyone else with investment opportunities. I wanted to create a network of informed family members who could serve as early warning systems if Derek attempted to resume his criminal activities. The reactions to my letters were mixed but generally supportive. Most family members expressed gratitude that I'd uncovered Derek's schemes and forced him to return their money. Several admitted that they'd had doubts about his business proposals but had invested anyway because of my supposed involvement. A few were angry that the situation had been allowed to develop as far as it had, particularly those who discovered Patricia's role in providing Derek with inside information. Uncle James was particularly direct in his response. He called me Sunday evening to thank me for preventing him from losing $15,000, but he also expressed his disappointment in Patricia's choices. "I've known Patricia since she was a little girl," he said. "I never would have imagined she'd be willing to help someone defraud her own family. That's not the person I thought she was." The conversation with Uncle James crystallized something I'd been struggling to accept. Patricia wasn't an innocent victim of Derek's criminal behavior. She was an active participant who'd made calculated decisions to prioritize her immediate financial situation over the welfare of her relatives. Her willingness to provide Derek with intelligence and character references made her a co-conspirator, even if she'd never directly solicited investments or handled stolen money. Monday morning brought a phone call from Patricia that I'd been expecting but dreading. She was furious about the letters I'd sent to family members, accusing me of trying to destroy her reputation and isolate her from the people she loved. She claimed that I was exaggerating Derek's actions and that most of the investments had been legitimate business opportunities that simply hadn't worked out as planned. "You're trying to ruin our lives," Patricia said, her voice shaking with anger. "Derek made mistakes, but he fixed them. He paid everyone back. Why can't you just let this go and move on?" "Because he didn't fix anything," I replied. "He just got caught and was forced to return money he'd already spent. And because you helped him do it, Patricia. You gave him information about our family members that he used to target them for fraud." "I never told him to steal from anyone. I just mentioned things in conversation, normal family talk. I didn't know he was going to use that information for business deals." The denial was so transparent that I almost felt sorry for her. Patricia was trying to rewrite history to cast herself as an innocent bystander rather than an active collaborator. But the evidence of her involvement was overwhelming. Derek couldn't have crafted such personalized and effective pitches without detailed inside information about each target's financial situation, professional background, and personal interests. Patricia, I said gently, Derek knew that Uncle James specializes in commercial electrical work. He knew that Sarah works in healthcare administration. He knew that Aunt Dorothy had recently inherited property and was looking for investment opportunities. He even knew about my promotion and my consulting plans. That level of detail doesn't come from casual conversation. There was a long silence before Patricia spoke again, and when she did, her voice was different, quieter, more defeated. We were going to lose the house, Cassandra. The kids were going to have to change schools, maybe move in with Derek's parents in Michigan. I know what he did was wrong, but I couldn't let that happen to my children. For the first time since this crisis began, I heard genuine emotion in Patricia's voice, rather than defensive anger. She was finally acknowledging her role in Derek's schemes, even if she was still trying to justify it through necessity rather than taking full responsibility for her choices. I understand that you were scared, I said, but stealing from our family wasn't the answer. There were other options. You could have asked for help, applied for assistance programs, negotiated with creditors. Instead, you chose to help Derek defraud people who trusted us. What happens now? Patricia asked. Are you going to file criminal charges? Are you going to try to send Derek to prison? The question hung between us like a bridge that could either be crossed or burned forever. Patricia was offering me a choice between justice and family unity, between holding Derek accountable for his crimes and preserving what remained of our relationship. That depends, I said finally, on what you and Derek do next. Over the following weeks, Patricia and Derek worked to rebuild trust with family members who'd been targeted by the investment schemes. Derek wrote personal apology letters to each person he'd defrauded, accepting full responsibility for his actions and acknowledging the harm he'd caused. He also agreed to attend counseling sessions focused on financial ethics and criminal behavior, with the understanding that family members could request proof of his attendance. Most importantly, Derek agreed to a comprehensive financial monitoring arrangement supervised by Uncle James, who had experience with business accounting and fraud prevention. Derek would provide monthly reports on all income sources, business activities, and significant expenses. Any business venture involving family members or requiring investments from relatives would require pre-approval from the monitoring committee.
Patricia also committed to rebuilding trust, though her path was more complex because her betrayal had been more personal. She attended family counseling sessions with me, where we worked through the emotional damage caused by her collaboration with Derek's schemes. She also wrote her own apology letters, acknowledging her role in providing Derek with inside information and expressing genuine remorse for prioritizing her immediate needs over family welfare. The monitoring and counseling arrangements weren't perfect solutions, and they didn't erase the damage that had been done to family relationships. But they represented a genuine effort by Derek and Patricia to address the underlying issues that had led to their criminal behavior, and they provided safeguards against future schemes. More importantly, the arrangements allowed our family to move forward without the complete destruction of relationships that criminal prosecution would have required. Derek's crimes were serious and deserved punishment, but sending him to federal prison would have created new victims in the form of his children and the family members who depended on his income. The decision to pursue restorative justice rather than criminal prosecution wasn't easy, and it wasn't universally supported by family members who'd been victimized by Derek's schemes. Some felt that Derek deserved prison time and that my approach was too lenient. Others worried that without criminal consequences, Derek would eventually return to criminal behavior once the monitoring period ended. I understood these concerns, and I shared some of them, but I also believed that the monitoring arrangement provided better protection for our family than criminal prosecution would have. A criminal conviction would have made Derek unemployable in his field, potentially pushing him toward more desperate and dangerous criminal activities. The monitoring system allowed him to continue working while providing oversight that would make future schemes much more difficult to execute. 6 months later, the monitoring system was working better than I'd hoped.
Derek was consistently meeting his reporting requirements and had actually become more successful in his legitimate construction business as a result of the increased oversight. Knowing that his finances were being scrutinized had forced him to be more professional in his business dealings and more careful about project management and client relations. Patricia had also benefited from the counseling and accountability measures. She'd found part-time work as a medical billing specialist, which gave her financial independence and reduced the pressure on Derek to generate income through questionable means. More importantly, she developed better communication skills and was more willing to address problems directly rather than avoiding uncomfortable conversations. The relationship between Patricia and me had slowly begun to heal, though it would never be the same as it had been before Derek's criminal activities. We'd established new boundaries and communication protocols that acknowledged the damage that had been done while creating space for gradual rebuilding of trust. The rest of our family had also learned valuable lessons about protecting themselves from financial fraud, even when it came from trusted relatives. Several family members had implemented better security measures for their personal financial information, and everyone had become more skeptical of unsolicited investment opportunities. Most importantly, Derek's schemes had forced our family to have honest conversations about money, ethics, and responsibility that probably should have happened years earlier. We'd established new norms around financial transparency and mutual accountability that made future criminal behavior much less likely to succeed. Looking back on the entire experience, I realized that my decision to pursue private resolution rather than criminal prosecution had been the right choice for our specific family situation. Derek had been held accountable for his actions, victims had been made whole financially, and safeguards had been put in place to prevent future schemes. While criminal prosecution might have provided more satisfying immediate consequences, the long-term outcomes achieved through restorative justice were more valuable for everyone involved. The experience had also taught me important lessons about the complexity of family relationships and the difficult balance between accountability and compassion. Derek's crimes had been serious and deserved consequences, but destroying his family wouldn't have made anyone safer or more whole. Sometimes, the most effective justice is the kind that focuses on preventing future harm rather than punishing past mistakes. As I sat in my garden on a warm autumn evening, watching the last tomatoes of the season ripen on the vine, I reflected on how much had changed since that terrible morning when I discovered my savings had been stolen. I'd learned that I was stronger and more resourceful than I'd known, but I'd also learned that strength sometimes meant choosing mercy over revenge, and that the most important victories were the ones that made everyone safer rather than just making me feel better. The house I'd bought with my recovered savings had become more than just a place to live. It had become a symbol of resilience, of the possibility of rebuilding after betrayal, and of the importance of creating security that couldn't be stolen by people who claimed to love you. Most importantly, it had become a sanctuary where I could process the complex emotions of forgiveness, accountability, and family loyalty without losing sight of my own values and boundaries. Derek's final payment had arrived on schedule, marking the official end of his restitution obligations. Along with the money had come a brief note expressing gratitude for my decision to handle his crimes privately and acknowledging that his family owed me a debt that went far beyond money. The note wasn't eloquent or particularly insightful, but it represented genuine recognition of the consequences his actions had created and the grace I'd shown in responding to them. 2 years had passed since Derek's investment schemes were exposed, and I thought we'd finally reached stable ground as a family. The monitoring system had worked exactly as intended, Derek had stayed clean, and Patricia had rebuilt most of the trust she'd lost with our relatives. I was planning my wedding to David, a wonderful man I'd met through work, and for the first time in years, everything felt genuinely peaceful. That peace shattered on a Tuesday morning when my phone rang with a call that would test everything I'd learned about family, forgiveness, and the price of second chances. The caller was Detective Martinez from the Financial Crimes Unit of the State Police. Her voice was professional but sympathetic as she explained that Derek was under investigation for a massive construction fraud scheme involving falsified building permits, diverted materials, and phantom subcontractors. The scope was staggering, with estimated damages exceeding $200,000 across multiple commercial projects. What made it worse was that Derek had been operating under my name as a co-licensed contractor, forging my signature on official documents, and claiming I was overseeing the medical facility installations that comprised the bulk of his fraudulent work. Detective Martinez explained that Derek had somehow obtained a copy of my professional licensing information and had used it to create a fake partnership called Von Sterling Construction Services. He'd been marketing this non-existent company to medical practices looking to renovate their facilities, claiming that his construction expertise, combined with my medical background, made them uniquely qualified for healthcare projects. The clients had paid substantial deposits based on these credentials, only to discover that the work was either never completed or done so poorly that it failed basic safety inspections. The detective's call wasn't just about informing me of Derek's crimes. I was potentially facing serious legal consequences myself. The state licensing board was investigating whether I'd knowingly allowed my credentials to be misused, and several clients were considering civil lawsuits against both Derek and me personally. Even though I was clearly a victim of identity theft, the legal system moved slowly, and the damage to my professional reputation could be irreversible while the investigations dragged on. Sitting in my kitchen after that phone call, staring at the wedding invitations we'd been addressing the night before, I felt a familiar rage building in my chest. Derek had learned nothing from our previous confrontations. The monitoring system, the counseling, the family accountability measures had all been nothing more than obstacles for him to work around while he planned bigger and more sophisticated schemes. Worse, he'd waited until I was at my happiest and most vulnerable to strike again, using my upcoming marriage and professional success as tools in his latest con. The investigation revealed the full extent of Derek's deception over the following weeks. He'd been operating the fake construction company for over 8 months, carefully timing his activities to avoid the monthly reporting requirements of our family monitoring system. He'd used a separate bank account opened with forged documents, maintained a fake office address using a mail forwarding service, and even created fraudulent insurance policies and bonding certificates. The level of sophistication suggested this wasn't desperation or poor judgment, but a calculated criminal enterprise designed to generate maximum profit while minimizing his chances of detection. What devastated me most was discovering how Derek had obtained my professional information. Patricia had photographed my licensing documents during a family dinner at my house, claiming she wanted to show her friends how proud she was of my achievements. Those photos had provided Derek with everything he needed to create convincing forgeries of my credentials and professional affiliations. Once again, my sister had betrayed my trust to enable her husband's criminal activities, and once again, she'd done it with a smile and words of love. The confrontation with Patricia was unlike anything we'd experienced before. She broke down completely when I presented her with evidence of how Derek had used the photos she'd taken. She admitted that Derek had asked her to get copies of my licensing documents, but claimed he'd told her it was for insurance purposes related to the monitoring arrangement. She'd suspected something was wrong when Derek became secretive about his work projects, but she'd chosen to ignore her instincts rather than risk another crisis in their marriage. Patricia's tears and apologies felt hollow this time. She'd had 2 years to prove that she could prioritize family welfare over her husband's schemes, and she'd failed that test catastrophically. Her willingness to help Derek steal my professional identity while pretending to support my upcoming marriage represented a level of betrayal that couldn't be explained by desperation or fear. It was a calculated choice to sacrifice my future for her husband's criminal ambitions. The legal consequences began mounting quickly. 3 medical practices filed civil lawsuits against me personally, seeking damages for incomplete work and additional costs they'd incurred to fix Derek's substandard installations.
Most seriously, the state medical board opened disciplinary proceedings that could result in the suspension or revocation of my license to practice. David and I postponed our wedding indefinitely while dealing with the legal crisis. He was incredibly supportive, but the stress of fighting multiple investigations while trying to clear my name took a toll on our relationship. Wedding planning transformed from joyful anticipation into another source of anxiety, as we couldn't make future plans while my career and financial stability hung in the balance. The criminal case against Derek moved forward rapidly once investigators realized the scope of his fraud. Federal prosecutors became involved when they discovered that Derek had used interstate communications and banking systems to facilitate his schemes. The charges included mail fraud, wire fraud, identity theft, and operating an unlicensed business enterprise. If convicted on all counts, Derek faced up to 20 years in federal prison and restitution requirements that would follow him for the rest of his life. This time, there would be no private resolution or family intervention. Derek's crimes had moved beyond the realm of internal family disputes into serious federal violations that affected multiple victims outside our family circle. The prosecutors made it clear that they had no interest in plea bargains or alternative sentences. Derek had demonstrated that he was a career criminal who posed an ongoing threat to public safety, and they intended to seek the maximum penalties allowed by law. Patricia's world collapsed when Derek was arrested at their home on a Thursday morning. Federal agents executed search warrants simultaneously at their house, Derek's office, and the fake address he'd been using for the construction company. They seized computers, documents, and financial records while Patricia watched helplessly, still in her pajamas, trying to shield her children from the chaos unfolding around them. The arrest made local news, with Derek's mugshot appearing on television alongside reports about the construction fraud scheme. Patricia called me sobbing after the news broadcast, begging me to help her figure out how to protect their children from the public humiliation and explaining that she couldn't afford a criminal defense attorney. For the first time since Derek's latest crimes had been discovered, I felt a flicker of sympathy for my sister, but it was overwhelmed by anger at the choices that had brought her family to this point. I hired my own attorney to handle the civil lawsuits and professional licensing issues, but I made it clear to Patricia that I wouldn't be providing financial assistance for Derek's criminal defense. She'd made her choice when she helped him steal my professional identity, and she would have to live with the consequences of that decision. Derek had burned through his final opportunity for family support, and I wouldn't allow him to drain more resources from people he'd already victimized. The next 6 months were the most difficult of my life. Fighting 3 civil lawsuits while defending my professional reputation required constant attention and enormous legal fees. David and I postponed our wedding again, then ultimately decided to have a small courthouse ceremony rather than the celebration we'd originally planned. The stress had strained our relationship, but it had also shown us that we could handle serious challenges together without losing sight of what mattered most. My professional reputation gradually recovered as the investigations revealed the full extent of Derek's identity theft. The state medical board dismissed the disciplinary proceedings after reviewing evidence that I'd been a victim rather than a participant in the fraud. 2 of the 3 civil lawsuits were dropped when the plaintiff's attorneys realized that pursuing an identity theft victim was unlikely to result in meaningful recovery. The 3rd lawsuit was settled for a nominal amount that my insurance company covered without affecting my premiums. Derek's criminal trial became a public spectacle that dominated local news for weeks. Prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence of his fraudulent activities, including bank records, forged documents, and testimony from victims who'd lost substantial amounts of money. Derek's defense attorney tried to argue that financial pressure and family obligations had driven him to desperate measures, but the scope and sophistication of his schemes undermined any claim that these were crimes of necessity rather than greed. Patricia testified for the prosecution, providing details about Derek's history of financial fraud and admitting her role in helping him obtain my professional credentials. Her testimony was devastating for Derek's defense, but it was also her first genuine acceptance of responsibility for enabling his criminal behavior. She acknowledged that she'd known Derek was lying about his business activities and that she'd chosen to help him rather than protect the family members he was targeting. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Derek was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison and ordered to pay full restitution to his victims, though the judge acknowledged that Derek would likely never be able to repay the amounts he'd stolen. Patricia was not charged criminally, but she faced her own consequences in the form of bankruptcy, foreclosure, and the challenge of raising 2 children as a single mother while carrying the stigma of her husband's crimes. The day Derek was sentenced, I felt a complex mixture of relief, sadness, and closure. Justice had finally been served, but at enormous cost to everyone involved. Patricia's family was destroyed, Derek's children would grow up with their father in prison, and multiple innocent victims had lost money they couldn't afford. The resolution felt necessary but not satisfying, like surgery that saves a patient's life but leaves permanent scars. Patricia and I slowly began rebuilding our relationship after Derek's conviction, though it took years of counseling and careful boundary setting. She moved back to our hometown with her children, found work as a medical billing specialist, and gradually regained the trust of family members who'd been victimized by Derek's schemes. Our relationship would never be the same, but we found a way to coexist that honored both our shared history and the harm that had been done. Derek had served 8 years of his sentence before being released to a halfway house where he worked in construction under strict supervision. He never contacted me directly, but Patricia occasionally shared updates about his attempts to rebuild his life and maintain relationships with his children. I felt no anger toward him anymore, but I also felt no sympathy. He'd made his choices repeatedly and deliberately, and the consequences were exactly what he'd earned through his actions. David and I eventually held the wedding celebration we'd postponed, surrounded by family members who'd supported us through the legal battles and professional challenges. My grandmother, now in her 80s, gave a toast that perfectly captured what we'd all learned from Derek's crimes. She said that families aren't defined by shared blood, but by shared values, and that sometimes protecting those values requires making difficult choices about which relationships to preserve and which to release. The house I'd bought with my recovered savings became our family home when David and I had our first child 3 years after Derek's conviction. As I rocked our daughter to sleep in the nursery we'd created in my former home office, I thought about the legacy I wanted to leave her. Not just financial security or professional success, but the knowledge that she could survive betrayal and build something beautiful from the ashes of broken trust. Derek's crimes had taught me that some people will always choose the easy wrong over the difficult right, no matter how many chances they're given or how much support they receive. But they'd also taught me that resilience isn't about avoiding pain, it's about refusing to let other people's choices define your future. I'd lost my savings, my professional reputation had been attacked, and my family relationships had been forever changed, but I'd survived all of it and built a life that was stronger and more meaningful than anything Derek could have destroyed. Looking at my sleeping daughter, I knew that Derek's greatest failure wasn't the money he'd stolen or the lies he'd told. His greatest failure was missing the opportunity to be part of something larger than his own immediate wants. He'd had access to a family that would have supported him through legitimate struggles, but he'd chosen crime over asking for help. He'd had chances to change course and make different choices, but he'd chosen manipulation over honesty. Most importantly, he'd had the chance to be a positive influence in his children's lives, but he'd chosen prison over being present for their childhood. The story wasn't really about Derek at all. It was about learning that you can't save someone who doesn't want to be saved, and that protecting yourself and the people you love sometimes requires making choices that feel cruel but are actually necessary. It was about understanding that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, and that second chances don't guarantee different outcomes. Most importantly, it was about discovering that your greatest strength often emerges from your worst moments, and that the future you build from broken pieces can be more beautiful than anything you originally planned. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.